helps us. So I'll just get rid of that.
Sorry, John.
Okay.
I'd forgotten. Pippa just reminded me to put the recording on.
Okay. Do you want me to backtrack a bit or not?
Yes, I think that would be good.
Okay. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Gilchrist, who's going to talk about Tales from a Denatured Land. As you can, how has nature changed in the Lindow Moss landscape, as we can see from this splendid introduction slide here. And when the talk was advertised, it was advertised about the shifting baselines of Lindow Moss, and the shifting baseline is an idea which is really powerful and helpful for understanding the changing, how we connect with nature in a changing world. And I want to illustrate that with a little story of my own. I grew up in Yorkshire, and over the wall at the bottom of the garden was farmland. And my father lived in the same house as a boy, and he told me that when he was growing up, he was kept awake at night by corncrakes craking in the fields over the garden wall. I've heard a corncrake once in my life, and that was on Fula, which is a very remote island off to the west of the Shetland Islands. Now, that shows you how things have changed. The boyhood sound that I remember is the cuckoo, and that was reliable harbinger of spring, and we heard those from the garden every spring, and you could expect that. And when we moved to Wilmslow, to a house just off Moor Lane in 1976, again we could reliably hear the cuckoo in the spring. I haven't heard one for some substantial time, really, on the fringes of Lindow Moss, and it would be a red letter day if I did. So that's my kind of take on shifting baselines. Just a gentle introduction. Anna will tell you properly what that's all about. I first met Anna 20 years ago as a first-year student in environmental management at the University of Manchester. And it's been a huge pleasure to see her grow and develop into a present role as a lecturer in environmental management and ecology in that university. Her research brings together social and natural sciences in exploring nature's response to changing socio-political conditions. So in a changing world, how does nature respond? And in today's world, that could hardly be more important. And I look forward greatly to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
So, Anna, over to you. You have the screen. We have your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction, John. Although 20 years does seem to have flown by in an instant, so it makes me feel a little old. I should also say that what I'm going to talk about today is part of a research project that I've been undertaking, particularly with my former PhD student. So that makes it John's PhD grandchild. Joseph Glentworth, who I think is here on the call, which is fantastic. I wasn't sure whether he could make it because he also has childcare responsibilities. So it's really good to see Joe here. So all credit to him as well. And Joe, if I say anything or don't say anything, do feel free to jump in and intervene. And also Francesca Jobson, who was an undergraduate RA and did some of the preliminary work on this project. So due credit to them. Good stuff. So what I'm going to talk about, and I'll give you a brief outline of what I'm going to cover, and I'm going to be frank. I'm going to start from a very depressing place, but I hope, therefore, that the only way is up. So I'm going to talk about the decline of nature and why that has happened. What not so much the causes, but why we haven't been able to solve it. So what is the problem with nature conservation? And I'm going to do that through the lens of shifting baseline syndrome, which John has already given a really nice introduction to. So I'm going to try and explain that with a few examples. And then we're going to zoom in to the Lindow Moss landscape to think about, well, why is that relevant to this landscape, and why might it be important? And essentially we'll look at that from two perspectives: how we can actually measure the change in nature in an ecological sense, but also how we can measure it in a sociological sense. So what are the perceptions of the changes in nature in the Lindow Moss landscape? And then hopefully I will try and then reflect at the end on what that might all mean for nature recovery within this landscape, as part of hopefully not just the restoration of Lindow Moss, the site, but the wider landscape as well. So that's what I'm going to be covering. I've probably got too many slides. I will probably talk for too long. So if I'm going on too long, Stuart, do just tell me to hurry up. We'll see how long it takes. Good stuff. Okay. So I said we'd start from a depressing point, and we're going to. So you are all, I'm sure, well aware of the state of nature globally. So this map shows the biodiversity intactness index. It's one of many ways that we can try and measure the state of nature. So this measures it in terms of how close to pristine nature might we be, and you can see that really it's only the really unpopulated areas in the kind of polar extremes, and some lesser populated areas of the developing world that still have those blue areas that might approach some level of pristine. And I mentioned that there are other measures. There's a biomass intactness index, which actually looks even bleaker. So that actually takes the dry weight of biodiversity, and that looks in the developing world, in the developed world, in Europe and North America, it looks even worse. So that sets the global context, and we know that nature is in decline and that we have a global biodiversity crisis. What does that mean in our country? Well, this is kind of hot off the press, really. This was a graph that was produced as part of the Environmental Audit Committee, which was commissioned by the UK government. And this shows the kind of changes in the percentage of species. Now, you can see in the long term, so the useful bit to look at rather than the wiggly graph is actually the bars on the right-hand side. And they show there that in the long term, we have seen a strong decrease in over 40% of our species within the UK. And although there is a bit of a rosy picture in the shorter term, that still only covers 20% of species. And still, you know, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've still seen significant decreases in biodiversity. This is just a snapshot of just some of those, what that looks like within the UK. So 53% of UK animal species are declining. That isn't just the little small creatures, although we know invertebrates are possibly struggling the most. But we don't collect data on those very well, but we do collect data well on mammals, and 19% of mammals are in decline. Many of you will be aware that hedgehogs are one of the mammals that is facing real problems, and probably the taxonomic group that is closest to my heart, because it's what I did my PhD on, is butterflies, and they are a real canary in the mine of what is going on for other insect species that are nothing like so colourful and charismatic. So 70% of British butterfly species are declining, and therefore probably lots of flies, wasps, things that just aren't quite as appealing and we don't collect as much data on, are probably in a similar, if not worse, state. It's not pretty, I know. Finally, what does that all mean with us within the global context? This is again, pulling from the Biodiversity Intactness Index. We are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So of 218 countries, the UK is ranked 189th worst. So we're really not in a good state in this country in terms of the state of our nature. Sorry, it's depressing, but as I say, it's important that we set that context. This quote is from Tony Juniper, who is the chair of Natural England, and he puts it fairly bleakly. So he says, we are a nature depleted nation, and what we have left, and that's critical for this talk tonight, what we have left are remnants of what was once here. Some of the statistics we have are quite troubling. We only have a tiny percentage left of some of the very biodiverse herb-rich meadows that we had in the middle of the last century, so post-war, post-Second World War. Our native woodlands are down to just a few percent of the country and continue to be under pressure. So, for example, we talk about the cover of woodland going up in this country, and it paints a really rosy picture that we're now at 14% of woodland cover, but the vast majority of that is actually coniferous woodland. It's not native. So yeah, our native woodland is really bleak, and we could go on and on and on, and he probably did go on and on and on. That was his comment to the Environment Audit Committee that I just referred to earlier. So the UK is not in a good state in terms of nature. What does that mean for nature, and what does that mean for us going forwards into the future? The challenge is that the decline of nature, or humans' impact on nature, is not new. It's well over 100 years ago now that the RSPB was formed, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds started here in Manchester, where I'm sat at the moment. But there has been a burgeoning before that. There was lots of movements in North America to try and protect certain landscapes. There's been recognition for well over 100 years now that that nature is in significant decline. This map shows how much money is spent on nature conservation annually in a global context. The total figures are pretty astounding. I mean, billions always sound big, but 21.5 billion is a lot of money. In the grand scheme of things, of course, lots more is spent on probably less important things, but it is still an awful lot of money. So in that context, why is it not working? Why is biodiversity in continued free fall when we're spending so much at trying to protect it? Well, to try and answer that question, I'm going to use an example. So essentially, nature conservation to date has largely focused, as the name suggests, conservation, on focusing on protecting what we have. So even where habitats have been restored and we've recognised that they have declined and deteriorated, we have restored them back to what we know. So let's use an example to try and understand that better. And we're going to do a bit of time travel to do it, hence the TARDIS, and we are going to travel to sunnier climes. So let's get on a plane and we're going to go to Brazil in I really struggle to say this, 2222. So we're obviously in 2022 now. So 200 years time, we go to Brazil. You are commissioned to go to Brazil and find out what is going on in terms of Brazil, because the nature is in free fall there. And some of the bird species that are associated with the habitats are continuing to decline. So this habitat is palm forests, and these birds have lived there for a long time, as long as we can remember, but they're definitely declining. Why would that be? The problem is that those species don't represent what should be there. They are the very last few species that have managed to cling on. And yet in 200 years from now, it would be very easy to imagine that they have always lived there, and that is the habitat that they need. And yet we look at this palm oil plantation and we know exactly what should be there. We know that palm oil plantations are being planted currently as we speak to replace tropical rainforest. So that's an easy analogy for us to get our heads around, because we can see that transformation of nature happening before our very eyes. And it's not just happening in South America, it's happening across large parts of Southeast Asia as well. But what about the UK? What's this got to do with the UK? Well, the thing is that the same is true of the UK. The landscapes and the habitats that we associate as being natural we don't just have to go back 200 years. We don't even have to go back 500 years. Some of them we might need to go back to the time of Lindow Man himself to start to understand what those landscapes might have been like without human interference. And even then, they'd actually been adapted quite a lot by Bronze Age and then Iron Age communities. So the example on the left there is actually in the uplands. It's upland heathland, and it's very much what most people would term in the UK as moorland, heather moorland. but it's a very, very intensively farmed landscape. It's managed usually for grouse. And the last few species that cling on there, like the curlew is a good example, John's cuckoo that he mentioned, those are some of the few species that can carry on existing but are still declining. We've protected those habitats because those species are there. So currently our conservation kind of mantra is to protect those landscapes in aspic in the way that they're needed, because that is where nature currently exists. But if we think back to the tropical rainforest analogy, what was there before? And we're only just really, as kind of nature conservationists and scientists, starting to actually think about, should we be conserving these places as they currently are, or should we be trying to think about what they used to be like? That can be challenging, because talking about going back to the past is not always the best thing to do, and it can certainly be quite challenging to implement, particularly in the cultural landscapes that we're talking about that have been lived and worked in for hundreds, indeed thousands of years, like those in the UK. So that process of forgetting what nature used to be like is exactly what John spoke about at the beginning. It's been termed shifting baseline syndrome. And the reason for that is because with each new generation that occurs, we probably, as quite young children, are exposed to nature. And actually, we know nature better as in childhood than probably at any other point. You know, you dig around in the dirt, you eat worms, you play with the leaves, you know, all the things that you see children doing that as we get older and more stoic and more boring, we forget to do. But there is that intrinsic joy of nature when you're a child. And that's what we fix as our knowledge of nature. That's the nature that we know. And yet what we don't know is what went before us. So some people might notice that nature declines in their lifetime, and that's what these vertical lines suggest for each generation. But what they're probably much less aware of is the nature that happened before their lifetime. And as that goes through periods of generation after generation, there is a steady and gradual decline in nature and biodiversity, and we're just not aware of it. So that's the concept of shifting baseline syndrome. And principally, it focuses on this generational shift. There are other ways it can be measured. I should also mention that also look at how people can forget within their lifetime of how nature changes. But that generational change is particularly interesting. So the person that actually first came up with this term was Dr. Daniel Pauly, and he developed this term in relation to marine ecosystems, so the decline in fish, essentially, and then specifically around the awareness of fishermen to the declines in fish. And this poster, I know there's quite small font, but don't worry too much about the writing. Try, if you can, to squint at the pictures and look at the size of the fish in the background. So what you might be able to see on the top picture in the 1950s is that the fish that are caught there, called giant groupers, are taller than the fishermen themselves. So they're in the background. They are hanging to the left as you look at it of the fishermen. That's the size of the fish that were being caught at those times. And as time progresses, the fish get progressively smaller, until in the last picture we can see that they are just literally a few inches long. The species has changed because those species, the giant grouper, is no longer available to fish. There's just not enough of them, and you know, the species that are being caught are much smaller. The critical thing here is to highlight that it isn't just about the shift in the baseline. The baseline refers to the ecological changes. That is, that in this instance, fish are getting smaller, or the available fish are getting smaller. It might be other ways that we can measure biodiversity. It might be the number of fish, for example. It's not just about that shift in the baseline. The syndrome is critical. It's about humans' awareness. It's a sociological phenomenon as well. So humans are unknowingly accepting that change. They are unaware that that change is happening. So that's very much what Daniel Pauly kind of came up with. And that happened back in 1995. And it took a good few years really to gain traction and get out of the marine ecosystem, as it were, and be transferred as an idea to terrestrial, to land ecosystems, to actually start to understand. And actually, we did some review of literature, and it's still principally focused on marine ecosystems, but it transfers equally well to land-based ecosystems too. Let me give you an example. John gave you his. I'm going to give you my example of generational amnesia, and I will use my own family to do that. So in the middle, the matriarch, who now has sadly died, was my granny Molly, and she was born in 1920. And what the years really nicely demonstrate in this is that, broadly speaking, on average, a generation is calculated at about 30 years, and that very much is what you can see from the born dates. So her daughter, my mum, is Lorna. She was born in 1955. I was born in 1982. Yes, I just had a significant birthday. And Freya was born, my daughter was born in 2011. So she's just started high school. And I've given an example of a relation, an example of shifting baseline syndrome relating to hedgehogs. So my granny Molly talked about hedgehogs when she was young. And I remember this story really clearly, that she talked about when she was young with her brothers. They would compete to collect as many hedgehogs as they could out in the fields, and then they'd bring them back to the back garden and race them down the back garden. Okay, so she never said absolute numbers, but you could just tell by the fact that they were racing to collect as many as they could that she's talking about multiple hedgehogs. My mum commented when she was a child that she remembers going out of an evening and you could almost guarantee seeing a hedgehog every night. Often you might see a whole family of them. So probably not as many as Granny Molly, but a good few still around. I remember making a hedgehog house when I lived in Carlisle, when I grew up as a child, and he would come back most nights, and that was an absolute thrill for me, kind of seeing a hedgehog, but it was very much only one. And it might not have been the same one, arguably, but I never saw more than one. And then the saddest thing of all, of course, is that my daughter, Freya, has never seen a live hedgehog. They, of course, do exist in the UK, and there are pockets and strongholds where they still are. But unfortunately, where we live, there aren't any. And so she's only seen them on the TV. And so that just shows this shift, that change in the baseline, that unless we were speaking to each other, we wouldn't know about those changes before our lifetime. And that has really important consequences, not just as an individual, but also for nature conservation. So when we started out on this project, one of the things that we did was actually think about, well, how do you go about measuring shifting baseline syndrome? And so the first thing we did was we did a literature review. So we searched for all of the journal articles that are out there on shifting baseline syndrome, which came up with 115. And we looked at the different ways that shifting baseline was measured. And the principal focus of that at that point was on how it had been measured in the ecological sense. So how had nature actually changed? And then what was the sociological measure? And almost always the sociological measure was just going and speaking to people. It might have been focus groups, it might have been interviews, it might have been surveys, but it was essentially just asking people what they felt. But the way in which it was measured ecologically was quite different. So sometimes it was the number of species that were found, and probably that was actually the most common way in which it was measured. So ecologically, we call that abundance. It was also the size of species, and we saw that in that example on the poster in terms of fish. There's also the variety of species. How many different types of species might you find in a given location? And also the size of habitats. So what is the total area that was covered? Some studies actually looked at how that had changed. And finally, probably the least common was looking at where species actually occurred, partly because that's quite difficult to measure over time in a consistent way, but it was sometimes used. So that shows kind of how we might try and go about actually measuring this change in the ecological baseline, so that we can then say, well, is that being matched? Is that being recognised by people? Are people aware that this nature has actually changed over time? It's important, I think, to recognise that it has multiple effects. to shifting baseline syndrome. And one of them is on our knowledge of nature. So it's not just about what we see or what we experience or what we talk about, but it's also what we know and what we pass on. So I really like this cartoon on the right by Cartoon Ralph, which kind of in the I've actually got really annoyingly the bar over, but if I remember rightly, it's the 1960s. I can't see the date. And the guy is saying to his wife, you know, man, Stalin murmurations really blow my mind. And in the current day, it's, wow, that's so cool. Are those Stalins? What's it called when they do that again? And then in 2030, it's, look, are those birds? You know, and the knowledge of murmuration, and then even the knowledge of Stalins has diminished over time. And so it's not just the knowledge of the bird, but it's also the language and the things that we use to explain and describe. And that's one of the ways that we can try and track the decline in the sociological phenomenon as well. So it isn't just a numbers game. It's not just about counting the nature, although principally in the academic literature, that is very much how it is done. I'm gonna have a mouthful of tea, sorry. So when we started out on this project, one of the things that we did is we encouraged our undergraduate students to speak to somebody from an older generation, which was usually either a parent or a grandparent, sometimes it was a neighbour. And we wanted them to ask them this question: what aspect or feature of nature do you feel has diminished over your lifetime that you would like to bring back to show me? So I'm just going to share those results with you. If I can manage to do this. Always risky, I know, trying to switch screens. So let's see whether I can do this. Okay, fantastic. So all being well. So this is what we found out. So this was narratives of a shift in baseline. And the really lovely thing about asking the undergraduates was that our answers were global, because our students are obviously international. There were lots in the UK, but there were also lots from all over the world. And I'm not going to read them out to you because they're very long. You might spot John's name in there in the corncrakes, because we also asked some of our friends that come and teach on the course unit. But I'm just going to flick through and just show you some of the headlines. Sorry, I just flicked back to that. And the link is there in the slide, so you can go back and look through it in this in more detail if you're interested. So we've got bamboo forest, so that was very much the size of habitats. Certain types of species that had just disappeared in terms of the crayfish. Urban megafauna, so seeing enormous animals in Kenya. Elms in the urban landscape in the city of London, of course, disappeared with elm disease. There were types of species, there were numbers of species, but it wasn't just that. And this is what got, I think, Joe and I really excited when we first did this exercise, and what really triggered this whole project to some degree. But there was also a more experiential side of nature. So I love this particular example, and I'm going to stop at this point and I'll go back to the slides. But John, born in 1945 from Northamptonshire, talked about the open fields and countryside that have been swallowed up with houses and buildings. As little children, we were able to play in fields and wasteland just left wild with flowers and small animals, voles, water rats. The biggest change is that at 4 or 5 year old children, we could go out on foot or tricycles all day on our own with a couple of sandwiches and a bottle of Tizer. No adults, and we would go for miles, exploring, experimenting, getting into mischief and enjoying ourselves with no worries, and of course not much traffic. And it was really lovely, and there's other examples in there of people talking about not so much the number or the types, and that's also really interesting, but also how they experienced and spent time in nature. And as a mother, it kind of terrifies me of the idea of my 3-year-old twins in a year or two time kind of disappearing off out into the countryside with butties under their arm and not seeing them for the rest of the day, because it's just obviously a culture that we just have moved so far away from. For some good reason, the traffic referred to, but also it's got lots of bad downsides as well, I think. So we were really interested in both sides there of thinking about how nature has changed in terms of numbers and counting things, but also how people have experienced nature. Right, so let's see whether this works in reverse. So perhaps more novel or different ways to recognise shifting baseline that we discovered from speaking to our students were a knowledge of nature, for example, species names, different experiences in nature, like the one I've just explained, and different ways in which kind of people interacted with childhood in their nature that had changed over their lifetime. And also the perception of what was natural or wild also changed, or they perceived had changed during that lifetime. And so I'm going to refer to those two slightly different ways in which we might think about the way in which nature itself has changed, the baseline has changed. And these ones I will very much refer to as experiential indicators. So the way in which we experience nature rather than the way in which we kind of measure or count it. It comes in later, so I just thought I'd try and flag that up quite clearly. So why is all this relevant? What does all this mean? What does it actually mean in terms of how we can try and stop this free fall of nature and this free fall of biodiversity? Well, understanding the concept is one of the most important things, because actually, as we understand it, and hopefully you see what an easy concept it is to understand, and how I'm sure you all have your own examples that you can think of and relay. That knowledge and the communication of that knowledge is one of the most important things, because what it then means is that we can start to try to reverse that trend. So communities can reverse the baseline of knowledge through nature restoration and education. So by restoring nature and by communicating about that knowledge and about how we've restored it and maybe how it might be different from what's gone before, but that's okay, but there was a before and it was different, is one of the ways that we can really start to, I think, address some of the real challenges we've faced with the status quo in nature's conservation, should we call it. But it will take time and commitment and perseverance if we're going to do that on anything other than a minute scale. So it's taken a long time to get there, but finally, let's land ourselves in Lindow Moss and try and translate all of this understanding of shifting baseline syndrome to this, what is a truly remarkable landscape. Why is it so remarkable? Well, you all probably know it better than me, so you'll probably have many reasons, but I think it's so interesting when we're thinking about shifting baseline syndrome. And one of the reasons is because there is this real challenge and this juxtaposition of what has gone before and what there is now. So the map on the right, as you're looking at it, is Burdett's map of Cheshire from 1777. And the one on the left is a contemporary map that obviously maps the Lindow Moss landscape character area. And you can see how faithfully and carefully that has been drawn to try and match Burdett's interpretation of what was then called Lindow Common. So I'm really going to have to move my bars around here to deal with this. So you've got Lindow End in the south, which clearly depicts the bottom. And then up at the top, you've got Morley Green and the Hall. And then you've got what you can't see in the Burdett's map of Cheshire are the two distinct areas are shown in black and red, and I'll refer to those in a moment in the contemporary landscape. It is a bit of a landscape of kind of juxtaposition, because in that sense there is this landscape of historical survival. There are so many artifacts and features within the landscape that actually are reminiscent not just of Burdett's time in 1777, but actually a long, long time before that, as we know. Obviously, Lindow Man is a good example, but arguably things that predate Lindow Man, so potentially Mesolithic finds within the landscape, and then through to much more recent, but still very much historic. So, for example, remnants of features from the Crimean War. One of the things that I think is really lovely about this landscape is that it is impenetrable by road. And that makes it really quite different and unique. So by accident, I kind of drove around the entirety, as did Joe the other day. We drove around the entirety of the Lindow Moss landscape. and you realise just how many dead ends there are. You can't get into it at all. It's only passable on foot, which is fantastic and probably quite similar to how it was back in the 18th century. So it is this kind of landscape of historical survival, but it of course also is a landscape of destruction, where you just go to Lindow Moss and we see the scale of destruction that's happened there. It's really kind of, it's that juxtaposition is really, really interesting. And when we're thinking about shifting baseline syndrome, that's really interesting, where we've got both history and contemporary destruction kind of hand in hand. We've also got a landscape of high nature value, because we've got some of the very rarest habitat types in this country, both within a very short distance of each other. Lowland heath in Lindow Common, showed in the red hash, and lowland raised bog on Lindow Moss, shown in the black hash. So that's, you know, really, really unique. And the fact it's so close to Wilmslow, you know, is another level of that makes it remarkable. But it's also, of course, a landscape where biodiversity has been removed. Obviously, really evidently in Lindow Moss from the peat extraction, but there's lots of other examples where biodiversity has indeed declined, not over just the recent period, but also over kind of centuries as well as decades. So I mentioned that there's no roads that really penetrate it, or certainly no through roads. So to some degree, it's a landscape of limited development, but it is also, of course, a landscape right on the urban edge, abutting right up to the Wilmslow town, and not far, of course, away from Manchester, the city of Manchester. So these real kind of interesting areas. So it means that there's lots of history, but that history is depleted and removed to some degree. There's lots of biodiversity, but the biodiversity has diminished. And there's lots of people, which means the study of shifting baseline syndrome within this landscape makes it really, really interesting. One of the things I also really want to highlight, and I will return to it later, is how much this landscape is a landscape of knowledge. How many people know and love and learn about this landscape, I think, is truly astounding. And that, of course, is another reason why studying shifting baseline syndrome is so important, because we can start to understand how much knowledge might be able to counteract and address the issue of shifting baseline syndrome when we're thinking about nature restoration. So this is what we set out to do, essentially, to understand how both nature and people's perception of nature had changed over time in the Lindow Moss landscape, and to reflect how that might influence current and future plans for the restoration, not just of the moss, although that definitely, but also restoration of the wider landscape. So we kind of thought about around three questions. First of all, has the ecological baseline shifted? Has nature actually declined, or has it increased? What is people's perception of how nature has changed? So obviously those are the two dual aspects of shifting baseline syndrome. And does that have any implications for how we might try and restore the Lindow Moss landscape in the future? Let's try and address that first point. How can we try and understand the change in the ecological baseline? Well, the simple answer is it's not very simple. We chose two particular areas for the focus of this study, which is Lindow Moss, shown in black hash, and Lindow Common, shown in the red hash. But we are really interested to try and see whether we can roll that out to other parts of the Lindow Moss landscape surrounded by the black border. We focused on those two particular areas because they are habitats that are so well recognised and protected that we hoped that might mean that we would be able to find out historically whether what the ecological baseline was and whether it's changed. So there were clearer records of change, and they are very high biodiversity value, because they're lowland raised bog in the case of Lindow Moss, and lowland dry and wet heath in the case of Lindow Common. So we focused on those two areas, but that is not at all to diminish the wider landscape. But just in terms of trying to understand the ecological baseline, that's what we looked at. What I'm going to present now is very much what my granddad would have called back of a fag packet. It's a very much an estimated baseline for the last 100 years. That's because before about 100 years ago, it gets incredibly difficult to assess the baseline ecology in terms of numbers. What we can probably safely say is that before 100 years ago, so before 1922, there were likely periods of stasis where biodiversity was broadly stable, but it was almost certainly within the much broader context of overall decline. And that decline will have been going on for centuries, arguably millennia, as the abundance, the numbers, the diversity of species, and the extent of habitats have declined gradually over periods, albeit with periods of kind of stability and arguably some periods of increases, but it's very, very difficult to try and match that. So I've drawn on different sources, landscape change, principally looking at aerial photography, drawn a lot on statutory agency assessments of these different habitats, both from English Nature and Natural England. That specifically is more for Lindow Common. There's much less available on Lindow Moss. Some local natural history accounts. So I haven't got the book to hand, but you'll all be aware of some of the really, really brilliant texts that are out there on Lindow Moss, and some other kind of local records that are around there from bird watchers that have provided information, for example. However, as I've mentioned, and with a big caveat, these are estimates, and what we still need is expert opinion and local knowledge. So I'm going to show you some graphs now, which are very much estimates and just really a kind of finger in the air as to what might have happened ecologically. So if you think there's something really wrong in these trend lines that are shown, do let me know at the end of the presentation, or drop me an email. We're going to look first at Lindow Common, and we're going to look at what's happened in terms of the overall number of species. And it's probably the hardest one to actually measure unless you've had regular surveys done there and that survey data has been recorded and made publicly available, which we just don't really have. So it is really just a straight line, recognising that across the last 100 years, almost every taxonomic group in this that we find in this country, birds, mammals, different invertebrate groups, reptiles, amphibians, have all seen a decline nationally in the total number of species found. Not necessarily in the types of species, that probably as well, but certainly in the actual abundance. And I remember my granny talking about seeing clouds of butterflies when she was a child. And it's something that we just don't see now. And I can often go for a walk with the dog and only see one or two large or small white butterflies in the whole day. So that refers to the abundance. What about species diversity? So this is the variety of different types of animals, birds and plants. Well, this is a bit more interesting on Lindow Common because there's probably two things going on. During the period, the interwar period, and then right through to the kind of middle part of the 20th century and then later on, Lindow Common was very bare and devoid of trees. It was almost dominated by heathland and some grassland, and we can see that from aerial photography. And then from around the 1970s onwards, the tree cover started increasing significantly. It had started increasing before that, but it really started increasing significantly, mainly down to a lack of management, but other factors as well. So that probably meant that the overall variety of species probably increased, because what we saw was a greater mosaic, a great mixture of different habitat types. So more tree species came in, more of the plants associated with woodland fauna, and then all the other flora, and then all the other fauna associated with that, birds, insects, all of those kind of things. So we probably saw a bit of a gradual increase overall, but the actual species associated with heathland, which remember is this really, really rare habitat type, decreased at the same time because woodland cover was increasing. So we see this increase in woodland species, which creates more diversity overall. And then in terms of specifically the heathland species, which are shown in purple, we see this dip. In terms of habitat area, well, Lindow Common hasn't changed in terms of its actual boundary. So we can say that the actual habitat area overall in terms of vegetation has remained very, very similar. Arguably some changes in terms of the total coverage of paths and other man-made surfaces, but very, very similar. But if we actually think about, sorry, slide accidentally there. If we think about the total area of heathland, then we know that that dropped because of the woodland cover increasing. So that's a kind of snapshot of what the ecological baseline might look like in Lindow Common. What about in Lindow Moss? Slightly different trend lines, but not that different. Probably overall, don't need to go through these in as much detail because we just know what happened in terms of peat being removed from the moss, at first manually. So whilst it did have an impact on the overall species number, the species diversity, and the habitat area in terms of restoring peat bog, we would have seen a gradual decline. But obviously what made the significant dip around the 1970s was when that process became mechanized. And I actually really struggled to find the exact point that happened when it did become mechanized, but it's certainly around that kind of time. At that point, we see a significant drop off in all of these different kind of indicators of the state of nature. But what we of course know is that very, very recently in this 100-year period, that decline that damage to the landscape has stopped. There has still been some work ongoing in preparation for the restoration, but just by removing the peat in a mechanical way, we have just seen what can happen when you give nature half a chance. In just a few years, and by changing fairly minor changes at this stage to the hydrology, we've already started to see some increase in the number of species that are seen on the site, particular references to birds from the people that I've spoken to, a greater increase in the variety of species, and of course in the actual habitat area. So although the cut over peat bog is broadly the same, the amount of area that is actually restoring, which went down to essentially zero, has started to creep up already, and restoration hopefully will progress that still further. So that's an estimate of what the ecology might look like in terms of Lindow Common and Lindow Moss. But the real focus of this talk and this research was about how has that perception been. But to think about shifting baseline syndrome, we need to remember that there is an ecological measurement that underpins it. So what might have happened? How have people's perceptions of nature changed in the Lindow Moss landscape over time? So to try and find that out, we conducted a survey. We produced a survey online, and we also administered it in person. A lot of those were done at the Wilmslow Community Show, and I'm sure several people, if not many of the people watching this, filled out one of those surveys, and if you did, thank you very much. So we collected over 100 responses from that survey, although actually only about 74 managed to complete every question. So we're focusing on that 74 for comparison's sake. 86% of the respondents of that 74 lived in Wilmslow, Mobley, or the surrounding area. So some people kind of travel from further afield, but the vast majority of people that filled it in lived in Wilmslow or the surrounding area. The graph on the right is quite interesting because it shows the length of time that people had known the Lindow Moss landscape. So the greatest kind of proportion of people, 20% of people had known the landscape for 30 or 40 years. So that, if we remember, is more than a generation, where we think of it, an average generation as lasting 30 years. So that was really exciting. If we're thinking about looking at shifting baseline syndrome, we've got a really significant proportion of people that have seen it through at least one generation. Indeed, actually 50%, over 50% or around 50% had known it for more than 30 years. So 40 to 50 years, 50 to 60 years, and more than 60 years. Those all added up to more than 50% of the respondents. So we then asked people whether they thought that whether the Lindow Moss landscape was important to them. The first question that we asked was, how important was it that you could that the respondents could access nature and natural spaces? And it was pretty mind-blowing, the response. 99% of people thought it was either extremely important, which included 82%, or very important that they could access nature and natural spaces. Now, you could argue that it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because people were filling in the survey and therefore they arguably chose to do it, who were probably people that are more connected with nature. But that doesn't just ring true, because people were kind of essentially pulled in at the Wilmslow Community Show and thrust with a survey. So it wasn't just that people opted to choose to take this particular survey. I think that's a really, really important and exciting finding, that so many people need to access nature. And then the next part, which is also really interesting, is that Lindow Moss is obviously part of that journey for people, that part of that ability to access nature, because 43% of people visit it at least once a week, and 9% of people visit it at least once a day. So therefore, more than 50% of the people that filled in the survey are visiting it once a week or more, which just shows that accessing nature and natural spaces is incredibly important for people, and that they do that within the Lindow Moss landscape. So what were people's perceptions of how nature had changed? So I'm going to look at 5 different variables. 3 of them are the classic ecological measure that you would expect to find in the journal articles had you read them. So the first refers to species abundance, the number of species. And you can see the figures there. So the axis on the left is the actual number of respondents, and I've put the percentages in for ease of comparison. So you can see that 37% of people felt that nature had declined over time. So that was the biggest proportion of people thought that the abundance of species had gone down. There was, though, also a large proportion of people that were not sure. So 30% of people didn't know whether the number of species had gone up or down in that time. And you could argue that if we had really hard ecological data, rather than my slightly wonky graphs, you could say that shifting baseline syndrome was happening, because the graphs show that nature is declining. So 37% of people are not falling prey to shifting baseline syndrome, but arguably the remaining respondents were, because they either felt it had stayed the same, some thought it had increased, or some just simply didn't know. And therefore, if they were unaware of that decrease happening, then that would suggest that shifting baseline syndrome is happening. But it's really, really not that simple, for lots of reasons. The answers that people gave are very, very context specific. They might have had really, really clear examples. For example, in their own garden that might be within the Lindow Moss landscape, where they clearly know that species abundance has definitely increased because they've actively done it. They might have been referring to individual other locations or sites that they're aware of how species has changed. So there's the locational context, but there's also the time context. If somebody has only known Lindow Moss in the last 5 years, they are absolutely accurate that the abundance of species has increased. So we can't read those figures and just say, yeah, shifting baseline syndrome has happened. It really isn't that simple. But it does show certainly that lots of people are not that sure, and that's quite interesting in and of itself. What about the next measure? Species diversity, the variety of different species that are seen. Well, an even larger proportion of people felt that that had declined. 42% of people thought that the variety of species had declined, and that really is likely to be in line with the ecological trends that we saw for both Lindow Common and Lindow Moss. But interestingly, there was also a large proportion of people that just weren't sure whether it had actually changed or not. So you can see this similarity between these 2 different indicators of shifting baseline syndrome that might suggest there's something interesting going on. And what about perceptions of how nature has changed in terms of the actual size of habitats? Now, as I mentioned, if you take it as the absolute measure of Lindow Moss and Lindow Common, then that hasn't technically changed. But of course, we didn't give people that context. They were just talking about the types of habitats that they see within the whole Lindow Moss landscape. And so this is really interesting because this is the variable where the highest proportion of people really recognise that there had been a decline. And that is likely to be in line both with the trends for the really recognisable and protected habitats on Lindow Moss and Lindow Common, the heathland and the peat bog, but also the wider trends within the landscape. So lots and lots of kind of recognition that it has declined. Interesting, does that suggest that people have more certainty about changes in habitat size than about variables associated with measuring, counting specific species? Or is it a clearer trend? Is it just a more obvious and recognisable change within the Lindow Moss landscape? Does it suggest that if we're talking about the way in which habitats have changed, there is actually likely to be less likelihood of shifting baseline syndrome because more people are aware when it declines and therefore they don't unknowingly accept that deterioration? The other two variables are more along the experiential side of the Lindow Moss landscape and how nature has changed. So the first is whether people thought the opportunities for landscape citizens to experience nature had changed. And you can see a very, very different trend in the graph. People were clearer, so there was less people that were unsure about this. And there were much more positive perceptions about opportunities to experience nature. So 28% of people thought it had increased, 28% people thought it had stayed the same, 23% of people thought it had decreased. So it's the first indicator that we've seen where actually decreased is less. And really interestingly, what about the knowledge of nature, knowledge and understanding of nature? The only variable where increase is really clearly identified as something that is increased within this landscape. There's no specific ecological baseline for this particular indicator. So there's no measure of nature knowledge over a significant period of time within this landscape. But there is lots of journal articles about the overall decline in knowledge of nature. So if this is right, and it is obviously people's perception, but if this is right, it completely bucks the trend of what is going on nationally and even internationally. Indeed, there is a journal paper out that suggests that the most affluent countries and the most affluent areas, which arguably the UK and Wilmslow would fit into, see the biggest loss of nature knowledge. And yet the Lindow Moss landscape has arguably, according to perception at least, bucked that trend. I think that reinforces my argument at the start that the Lindow Moss landscape is a landscape of knowledge. It's a landscape that people know and love and care about, and they share that knowledge with each other. And I think you only have to look at the Festival of Nature to appreciate and see that. So, sorry, I'm just going to try and move the bar down. Here we go. So, what does that actually mean when we think about time? So I mentioned that if somebody had only known the landscape for a very short period of time, they would view it very differently to if you had known the landscape for a very long period of time. So what these graphs show is the same data, but separated out by the length of time that people had known the landscape. And the simple answer is it's not that clear cut. But there are some interesting areas. I think it is fair to say that those that have known the landscape the longest, so with looking here at the yellow tops of the bars, those people that have known the landscape for over 50 years are more likely to suggest decreases in these quantifiable indicators of the change in nature. Really, really noticeable for the variety of species, probably the biggest, also the size or extent of habitat, But even the abundant or number of individuals seen, you can see that the number of people that had known the landscape for over 50 years is greater than it was for increased or for not sure. The other end of the spectrum is less clear, definitely. There's much more of a mixture of people recognising trends across the other three kind of time brackets. But an interesting point that potentially, if you've known the landscape for a very long time, you may be actually more aware of decline than if you have known it for a shorter amount of time. But we must remember that the landscape hasn't changed equally, and that recent trends, particularly in Lindow Moss and indeed in Lindow Common, have been probably quite positive for how we measure and understand nature. The experiential indicators, the opportunities for nature experiences and the knowledge of nature, certainly much more of an even distribution across the different periods of time that people have known the Lindow Moss landscape. Very difficult to draw any kind of trend, but certainly we can see there that there seems to be this difference between how people understand nature, whether that's in a kind of quantifiable way or in the way in which they experience it. So I hear you all say, why, Anna, why does all this matter? Why do we really need to know about shifting baseline syndrome? And where is this going to actually take us when we're thinking about the Lindow Moss landscape? Well, this quote by Celia Noss, I have amended it slightly, but they said that the greatest impediment to nature restoration is an unwillingness or an inability to imagine it. Now, I've changed two things there. They actually use the term rewilding. And a lot of what we're talking about in terms of restoring nature is also termed rewilding, but rewilding has lots of political connotations. So I changed it to nature restoration to match what we were talking about tonight, but I think the same meaning is very much transferred. And I added the inability because an unwillingness to imagine it makes it sound like it's a conscious decision. And I think what shifting baseline syndrome tells us, it can often be through no one's fault of their own that they are unable to imagine the potential that nature has. So what might that mean for restoring the Lindow Moss landscape? Well, we have created a second survey very, very recently. There's far fewer respondents. So Joe and I went out really recently onto Lindow Moss and to Lindow Common. And this was very much a face-to-face survey, although we have created an online version as well. And essentially what this survey was trying to do was trying to really bury down into the spatial location of where people felt that nature had changed, but also how they perceived the state of nature in those different locations and what they saw as the priorities for landscape restoration within that landscape. And we also kind of organically, I think it's fair to say, started to discuss with people what they think pristine nature would look like and what that might mean for the nature restoration. And if any of you are attending the guided walk on Saturday, that's going to very much be the focus of what I'm talking about in terms of that aspect of it. So just a few kind of concluding thoughts really based on this. So what was the perceived state of nature? So we gave people a fairly kind of limited set of choices. We asked them whether they perceived Lindow Moss as either pristine, restored, restoring, degrading, or degraded. And almost universally across the people that we spoke to, Lindow Moss very, very clearly came out as restoring. And we can see why. We know how, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it would definitely either have been degraded or degrading by anybody's standards. And since the peat extraction has stopped, we can clearly see that it is restoring. And, the pride and joy and happiness that people expressed in seeing nature coming back to Lindow Moss of its own accord was really magnificent. Interestingly, Lindow Common definitely divided more people, much more debate about what state Lindow Common was in. Some people very much saw it as restored, so they'd seen a landscape that had arguably diminished and been less managed and less loved in their lifetime, and they had seen it go through a process of active management really to bring back this really rare habitat type, pretty much from the brink as it was when it was the active management really kicked in earnest in the late 1980s and 1990s. However, some other people saw some of that active management, the cutting of the heather, the regular removal of trees, as in some way degrading or leading to degraded nature. So lots of kind of different perceptions around how nature was kind of what was happening to nature in Lindow Common. What was really clear from conducting this survey, and it's the lovely thing that you don't get from an online survey, doing these surveys face to face, is what was repeatedly brought up by the people that we spoke to was how important it was that nature, the appearance of something being natural, either it was natural or it appeared natural or wild, was really, really intrinsically important to different people. And that was really quite interesting. Sorry, my slide is not clicking on for some reason. What's going on? Here we go. Another important question that we asked was, what were people's priorities for the landscape restoration? And I have to say, I found this answer really, really exciting and pretty mind-blowing. So we put quite a lot of things in there about people's ability to enjoy, access, learn more about the landscape, and pretty much universally people could tick as many as they wanted, so they didn't have to prioritize one over another. They just ticked whichever they thought were important. But by far and away the clearest, the one that had the most number of responses, was that the priority for landscape restoration was to restore nature to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises. I think that's such an important message. I think it shows how far we have come in just a few short years, really, for people to really embrace and understand the severity of the situation that we're in. And so from talking to people about how they kind of perceived the landscape and what they thought were the priorities, and how they could actually imagine nature restoration in the Lindow Moss landscape, it became clear that there's certainly no one type fits all, but there was this kind of difference in opinions. And so I've put this on a potential kind of spread of two axes. One that relates to what the kind of priorities were, whether it should be really focusing on restoration for nature or restoration for people, and whether the focus should be on it being wilder and feeling or looking more natural, or whether it should be more managed. And if you put those two spectrums together, you end up with these four boxes. So if people thought it should be managed for nature, the real focus there is on maximising biodiversity. So how can we get as many species, and maybe the biggest number of species, within the landscape? Other people really focused on this feeling and actual ability of nature to be wild. So some people spoke about restoring the landscape, not about coming in and intervening and doing things, but they wanted nature to do its own thing and restore itself, achieving its own sense of wildness. You could argue definitely that wouldn't be achieved by just leaving it, but there were people that really wanted to achieve wildness within the landscape. Other people were much more kind of focusing on how it felt. So they kind of wanted a sense of wildness, but that wildness was for people and how they felt, and that ability to escape and the restorative benefits of nature, really focusing on that feeling of wildness. And very few people, there were a couple of people that thought that the landscape should be more managed for people. So more benches, more hard paving, but they were very, very few and far between from the people that we spoke to, much more in the other three boxes. And I'm not going to put numbers in or anything like that, because it was more just to show this diversity of kind of thoughts and aspirations for how nature might restore. So to conclude, and I have spoken for too long, but hopefully I'm finishing now. This is my last slide. Shifting baseline syndrome really has a dangerous potential to diminish our awareness of declines in nature. it also has the potential to diminish our ambitions for nature restoration. Unless we're aware of what we have lost, we can't ever seek to put back to the level that it was once there. However, nature awareness in this landscape is incredibly strong. I just found it so inspiring how many people really knew and cared, and even if they didn't have the exact answer about how many species had declined, they knew so many facts that they wanted to share with you about the landscape, and that was just so rewarding to hear. It did come through from the data though, and it's not something that I've particularly found anywhere else, that I think it's easier for people to detect the change in baseline for some indicators more than others. So for example, it's easier for people to see a change in the size of habitat area than it is to see a change in the diversity of species. It's not particularly surprising. It's easier to see when a woodland shrinks in size over time than it is if just the sheer number of species. So that's an interesting area. Is that something that we should be trying to change in this landscape of knowledge? Can we change that so that people are more aware of how other ecological indicators have changed over time? There are lots of aspirations for landscape restoration within this landscape. Almost everybody had a comment and an idea about where it should go. And really important was how central nature restoration to address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis were in those aspirations. But I think it's important that we recognise that when we're trying to restore a landscape, nothing is going to fit neatly into one box. And perhaps something that we might want to think about when we're thinking about how might we restore the Lindow Moss landscape is, might different parts of the Lindow Moss landscape address some of those different aspiration types that I showed in the last graph. Good stuff. I will stop talking and drink some cold tea, and I'm happy to have any questions if anybody has them.
Well, Anna, absolutely fantastic. I mean, I'm sure we've got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to ask Pippa to sort of manage the questions, and I think, Pippa, the easiest way really is to make you joint host when I can find you.
Oh, okay.
There we are.
Put on the spot there, Pippa.
Make co-host. Right, Pippa, you're now co-host, and you can do whatever I want to do. We can go for a free-for-all, and you can all unmute, which is not advisable, but if you do want to ask a question, can you pop your hands up, and then when we address you, we'll ask you to unmute at the same time. So we've got one question at least on chat, and I'll kick off with that. Flo has asked Anna that she wasn't aware that rewilding had political connotations, but she thinks that rewilding goes further than restoration, and in the same way that regenerative design in her own field goes further than sustainable design. Anna, whilst others are thinking of their questions, would you like to just come back on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly think, first of all, the first bit, does rewilding have political connotations? Certainly, I think it does. So George Monbiot published Feral, in 2013, which to some degree was the kind of public awakening to rewilding in this country, even though it emerged far earlier than that in North America in the kind of 1990s. But in that, he talks about the challenges, and he talks about it in no uncertain terms in the way that George Monbiot does, of what that means in the cultural landscapes that we live in today. So a good example is that he essentially spoke about rewilding some of the uplands in terms of sheep hill farming, and what that meant in terms of potentially removing the culture. That has become so political in Wales that nobody uses what they now term the R word. So there's lots of things going on which are bound to nature restoration and rewilding, but nobody terms it in rewilding in Wales because it was so political. So it definitely was. Rewilding, I think I would agree with you, does go further than restoration. Again, it's another contested point. There's a very famous journal article basically saying that the term rewilding should be abandoned because it's just restoration by another name. I think exactly the things that we've been talking about today, about the idea of different baselines, and where we think about restoring to. And that doesn't have to be a past baseline, that can be a novel future baseline. But I think rewilding does go further than nature restoration used to. But you know, there's lots of debates and things that, I mean, it's something that you could talk about for another 2 hours. And yeah, and in terms of design, yeah, I think that's a very kind of relevant point. And similarly, kind of regenerative farming over kind of agri-environment farming. So I think the key message from that is, I think we are starting to broaden our horizons and embrace more ambitious ideas for what nature can and should be. And maybe, and I think the hardest thing about it all, and the way in which rewilding is different from restoration, is the really challenging thing that humans struggle most with, and that's about relinquishing control. So nature conservation has almost always focused on our position within the system of managing and controlling nature for nature's benefit, but that we were principal architects in that. You know, people often talk about heathland as a man-made habitat. Well, it's not, because there are species that are just adapted to heathland habitats, and they therefore were specialized hundreds and thousands of years ago through the process of evolution. So we don't need people to create heathland, but we might need animals that aren't around anymore, and that again is another area of contention. So yeah, so yeah, you kind of struck at a real point that I can just gabble on about forever, because rewilding is very much an area of passion. So I'll shut up now.
Good. Have we got any other questions?
Chris McCloy has a hand up.
Chris, you need to unmute, Chris.
Excuse me for being ignorant, but I'm thinking about the slide that you showed fairly early on, where it was sort of moorland on one side with heather, and then you've got the thing in the middle, and then you've got trees and a more diverse landscape. And the implication at the time, I think you were saying, was that we think that the moorland is what we want, but if we look even further back, we'd find that it was the trees. Now, it occurs to me that you would not have a peat bog if you hadn't had trees. And certainly you used to find the skeletons of old trees when you walked across the bog. So why are we concerned with taking it to one level but not further back, first of all? Secondly, the Lindow Common, there were suddenly loads and loads and loads of silver birch trees, and they were got rid of, obviously. Yeah, it upset people, because we were talking about we need trees for our environment, and particularly with it being near a main road, and silver birch are known for being able to extrapolate the bad things out of the air. So it was as if nature was going, hello, here's what you need. And then we went, no, it's not, we want this. Sorry, that's kind of two questions in one. Is that all right?
No, absolutely. And first of all, not in any way ignorant. The first question about baseline was a very good point. Now, I should clarify, and it was my error really. I actually showed two really artificial man-made habitats, but I can see now that it didn't look like that. So the photo on the right didn't actually show natural forest, although arguably at a distance it could easily have been the Caledonian pine forest. But what it actually showed was the Sitka spruce plantations that we often find in the upland habitats. So so non-native conifers being planted kind of intensively, and people will often go to both of those landscapes and think that they're both really natural and kind of get all of the restorative benefits of nature, which is fantastic, but they're not natural. But the point that you make in relation to that about which baseline is the absolute crux of what we're talking about. And you've kind of stolen my thunder slightly, so I'm not going to give too long an answer, because it's very much what we're going to be talking about on the walk on Saturday. So we had some really, really interesting discussions with people about what baseline they thought it should be. So what was pristine? And you're absolutely right. You could roll back to different points in time and see different points in the landscape. The point about Lindow Common, yeah, absolutely. So there's two things going on here. So there's one, which is the gradual vegetation succession, which happens naturally in that landscape and is very much a natural process and arguably should be allowed to proceed. The counterpoint to that is the perspective of Natural England, who are the statutory nature conservation body, who see this incredibly rare habitat, lowland heathland, one of the rarest habitats in this country, and it diminishing before their very eyes. And their job is to essentially maximise the area of this really rare habitat. So that means removing the trees. Why do we have to do that? Why are we removing trees when they are growing naturally? The simple answer relates back, I think most people that know me really well would say everything in my life relates back to rewilding, but arguably it does in this particular instance. The reason why we're putting in that man-made management is because the processes that created heathland are no longer there in that environment, and that is essentially grazing by large herbivores. So in prehistoric times, we would have had aurochs, kind of the native large cow. We'd have had wild ponies, we'd have had wild boar, and they would have been grazing that landscape in a mixed fashion. So there would have been patches of heathland and patches of woodland that emerged, and the way in which those large animals feed, they all feed differently and they create different types of vegetation structures. So you wouldn't have had this really synthetic block and straight lines of cut heather. You would still have had patches of scrub which kind of occurred organically, and which very few species ate, that provided the cover. The problem is you could graze Lindow Common, and arguably there is actually now scope that we could do that. The argument that it's never been done is twofold. The first is that it's very close to the town and people walk their dogs there, and anybody who goes to Lindow Common know how favoured it is by dogs. However, you only have to get a dog kicked once by a cow and people don't walk their dogs off the lead there anymore. I'm a dog owner. I say that as a true lover of dogs. But the second issue is fences. And fences have obviously already been erected in some parts of the common and caused a lot of consternation. Fencing large parts to allow cows is problematic. But there is a new magical technological solution. And that is that we can mob graze cattle with collars on. So the collars are programmed technologically. There's no fences involved, and when the cow reaches the kind of drawn in electronic bounded area, it gives a small electric shock, and very quickly the cows learn where they can graze. So you could actually have cows grazing on Lindow Common. You wouldn't need any of the artificial processes of cutting the heather. It's something that I need to approach Cheshire East Council about, but they probably wouldn't see it as a priority, but I'd love to do it.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. Have we got any more questions?
Can I ask a question?
Anthony.
Pauline's got a hand up.
Oh, should we take Anthony first and then Pauline?
Anna, thank you. I just so much enjoyed that. Can I ask you a question about Lindow Moss and trees? Because the trees around the edge, and to an extent those growing in the moss itself, create that sense of wildness.
Yeah.
If we had 9 inches of water, that would probably not be so much of a problem, but because of the runway, it's not going to be as deep as that. So we've still got a problem with trees extracting water out of the moss. But I know in Scotland, they don't bother with the trees in mossland areas, certainly around some areas. They just let everything sort itself out. And whereas the plans for conservation, as I understand it at the moment, are to remove all the trees, if we can, from the body of the cut over peat bog.
Yeah.
So, and then obviously you're removing nesting places as well in doing that. So what's the best way in your view to do this?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to that the matrix that I showed at the end about what our aspiration is for why we're restoring the cut over peat bog. Undoubtedly, the approach that has been taken at the moment is to manage for nature. So that is about maximizing biodiversity from a kind of nature conservation point of view. So they are saying that if we increase this really rare habitat type, that's going to be the best possible thing for biodiversity. That is, in my opinion, ecologists wearing ecologists' hats. But this landscape has to be about more than just the ecology. I mean, I've barely mentioned Lindow Moss tonight, which I feel terrible about. I'm passionate about the cultural importance of this landscape, but also the present day and contemporary importance of this landscape. And what was so amazing speaking to people was just how much people love this landscape. And I think, therefore, it's about trying to create a landscape and a site in terms of Lindow Moss that meets as many people's objectives as they can. My, therefore, opinion is that we shouldn't remove that many trees. Certainly in the first instance, we need to restore the hydrology first in the peat bog and see how that works. I mean, hell, I hope this isn't right, but it might not work. There is even the risk that it doesn't work and we can't bring it back. I think that's unlikely. I think it will. But if we cut down all those trees just because we thought we could do this, it's the worst example of humans intervening when we don't know what we're doing. The second example is that, yes, definitely trees will reduce the water table a bit. But if we manage to get this balance right, and we've got the sluice that allows us to keep the water level fairly high, it will be a fairly inhospitable place for trees. It won't be totally So I think on the actual surface of the peat bog, I don't think trees will be too much of an issue. But it's that Scottish approach of, shall we see what happens rather than just trying to intervene? And certainly the importance of the surrounding landscape, that feeling of enclosure, the magic of being on the moss and having no idea that you are a stone's throw away from a town is invaluable. Just, you can't even put a value on it. It is just, yeah, it's so important. So I think, yeah, really, really, really important that we don't let that escape. So and similarly, kind of compartment 10, where we've got that secondary regrowth woodland, I think we should keep that and see what happens rather than just trying to maximize the area for biodiversity.
Great. So that time's getting on, so I'll just take two more questions. I've got one from Pauline. Do you want to give your question?
Anna, thank you so much for such a very absorbing and new to me topic. It's fascinating, and all your research is wonderful because we know the love that people have for this landscape and the interest. But the person doing the restoration and putting in all the plans to Cheshire East is Ben Malin. And are we putting all our reliance on him getting the plan right for restoration? I know John has put in an awful lot of work on it, but what other the public that you've been asking questions have opinions, but surely they're never going to have an input into the restoration. And this, I'm just being a devil's advocate here. I know you're trying to get up a committee to look in, support Ben, or moderate, what's it called, the liaison committee. But we talk about it at length, but in the end, Ben Malin is doing all the plans, isn't he? How can you influence him?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I do think it's one of my kind of biggest bugbears, really, with the way that nature conservation goes, is that it's become such a bean counter approach. It's all about measuring things and maximising, given whether it's the area or the number of things that are occurring within an area, and it's just so hollow. The only thing I would say is that the most important thing at this stage is that the peat bog is restored, and that process begins to happen. I think time can be an amazing thing. Once that restoration starts to happen and more people see the radical transformation that's happening, and arguably, hopefully, there just needs to be less intervention by the restoration plans. I hope at that point there will be more scope for people. Arguably, it's too late. I totally agree. I think it is. But my hope is that over time, and maybe if we can do something really ambitious, like try and put in a Heritage Lottery Fund grant to try and look at the restoration of the wider landscape, is that a way that we can really highlight the importance of people within the landscape? Because I totally agree. It's utterly vital, and they're missing a trick. not least the amount of unbelievable expert knowledge that they're kind of blindsiding. But yeah, just so much that they're just not paying attention to, but also the kind of, the non-expert audience and how much they love and care and know about the landscape is truly astounding, and really, really, I think, having done quite a lot of landscape ecological analysis, really quite unusual, the kind of investment of people and time. And part of that, I think, is the cultural heritage and the importance that has in people's lives.
Lovely.
Can I just add a point to that as well?
Yes, Joe. Yeah, please do.
I think often in nature conservation, this idea of shifting baseline syndrome can be used by conservationists to justify their actions. So they can say, oh, people aren't aware of what's been lost, and therefore we're going to have to use the metrics that we've got to show them. And I think that this is actually a really powerful case study to say that in many landscapes that isn't the case, and actually a lot of people have knowledge that transcends this kind of dilemma, and that really needs to be used as an input into these conversations about the future of the landscape.
It's definitely something we found in the literature, wasn't it, Joe? This whole idea that you have an ecological measure of the baseline, and then you have people's perceptions. And universally within the literature, it was, well, if those don't match, then the people are wrong. Because the science is there, and we know that the species numbers have declined. And actually, you know what? I know how ropey species abundance counts can be, because there's multiple different ways it can be counted over generations and decades. And yet that is the hard science. And what people think or believe or know is like, oh, well, it can't be right because it doesn't match the data.
And even worse, that the data is operating on a shifted baseline syndrome. So they use the data they can get hold of, which is often like the 60s or 70s. And that doesn't always, it's the same dilemma. It doesn't go back far enough.
Yeah. So
we've just got one last question from David Jess, which I'm going to read out because they have no microphone. Is there any possibility of long-term funding, I assume, for rewilding, renaturing, new naturing on the moss?
A really good question to end on is the kind of conundrum of how you make it all happen. I think one of the really exciting things is that there's the mechanism to make the first part happen, which is being done by kind of Terraqueous and Krog and Pete as some kind of reparation for the travesty that they've caused. But they are now doing that, and that is a catalyst, I hope, for something bigger and grander. Two quick answers, because I have to get a train in 20 minutes. The first is a kind of mechanical answer, which is something called biodiversity net gain, which is essentially a new process that's been implemented into the planning process that says that if a development is going to have an impact on nature, it's no longer acceptable that the nature declines. Indeed, it's no longer acceptable that the nature remains the same, so that you might offset it by planting the same amount of trees somewhere else, but that there has to be a net gain in biodiversity. That essentially means that developers are being forced to put money into a pot to restore nature in certain places. And that holds a really exciting potential mechanism for areas and sites like Lindow Moss. But it would need to be part of Cheshire East Council's nature restoration plan. So they've got to develop a nature recovery strategy as part of this policy, and the Lindow Moss landscape needs to feature in that heavily, and it must, because of its value anyway. The second, I think, is a really important one. It's using the cultural heritage as a leapfrog. This isn't just an important landscape for nature, it's an important landscape for people, and it's an important landscape, an incredibly important landscape, because of its cultural heritage. And I think because of that, we can try and use some of the funding mechanisms that recognise that it's not just about nature, it's about bringing all those things together. So the Heritage Lottery grant are a really good example. So I hope there are funding pots available, but I don't think it will be instant. And I think it will be about trying to develop a really coherent and clear argument, pulling from the enormous array of expertise that this landscape has to try and demonstrate how that can be achieved.
Fantastic. Just to remind everybody that Anna's leading a walk on the Moss, leaving Lindow Common Car Park, I think it is, at 1 o'clock on Saturday. And you can book on the festival website, and that will be a great link to this. So just going to go over to Anthony, who's going to give a vote of thanks.
Anna, thank you so much. This has been a really inspirational talk. I think the well-being of us and the Moss has been enhanced by your talk this evening, and you've really captured both the passion and the science, which is a rare gift. So thank you so much. It's been really great.
Thank
Could you please unmute in traditional manner?
Hope you catch your train and see you on Saturday.
Yes, I need to go. I must dash, I'm afraid, because it's at 2:20. So I 20:09. So I must dash. But thank you all so
Take
much.
care.
Really appreciate it.
See you on Saturday.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye.
Thank you.
And to those that aren't dashing, just a reminder to look at the Festival of Nature website. And in particular, we have a very, very exciting day on Sunday when we have the central Wilmslow closed. Amazing activities. We'll see how much cleaner the air is when we've got no motor cars. Thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you, Pippa, for sharing the load. And just take care. Make sure you come and join us this time next week as well, when we have Francis Hill, Dr. Francis Hill, Senior Lecturer in Innovative Technology, one of our own, and that will be yet another informative and interesting evening. So thank you all. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye for now.